All right, in this episode, we're going to cover our final two spheres of mobilization, which are community and church. Starting off with community, what we're talking about here is your personal circles of influence. This could be the local church that you attend, friends and extended family, people you work with, or other people in your life that you are coming into contact on a regular basis. Keelan, I know you and I have both benefited so much from having community around us, and we want to cover 5 ways that you can mobilize generosity within the relationships that you already have.
We've spoken to many givers over the years, and these 5 methods of inspiring and encouraging generosity among those around you are particularly powerful. And those are celebrating, congregating, collaborating, catalyzing, and championing. So let's start off the bat with celebrating. When we're talking about celebrating in the context of generosity, we're talking about helping others to see and feel the experience of generosity through you.
Now, we've heard tons of great stories around generosity through the Finish Line podcast. What have you noticed makes a good story around generosity?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a couple points that I think are particularly helpful. The first point I'd say is share story over strategy. And this is one that I struggle with sometimes, being kind of a strategy-minded person in general, but there are times to share story and there are times to share strategy. Both are important, but specifically when you're trying to encourage or inspire generosity in others, that is a time where story is going to be much more powerful than strategy. Strategy is going to be much better for times where people are in a mindset of wanting to grow and learn in generosity, who are already excited and wanting to take steps further. Your story has much more to do with the faith involved and the emotions involved and the people and relationships involved in the course of the journey that God has taken you on. And that brings me to the second point, which is that it's much more powerful to tell God's story rather than your story. One of the interesting things about generosity is that when people hear you telling your story, then it feels much more connected to the context of your life and your circumstances. And it's harder for people to see how that might apply in their life and their circumstances. They might think, yeah, if I was in the exact circumstances you are in, I would love to take that same leap or that same jump that you did. But my life is just different than that, and I can't be generous like that. When you tell your story as part of God's story, that God is doing this big thing in the world and invited me in this way, and this is how he used pieces of my life and how he's designed me in his story, then that's a story that people can actually see themselves in. They can say, I want to be a part of that same story, and I want to see how God might use me. I want to be a different character in that same story. And that's what's really exciting about generosity, is that God has an infinite number of invitations into that story, and he wants us to each play our own part. And so framing your story as part of this bigger story that God is writing is very encouraging and inviting to those that hear it.
Another point I would make is that it's helpful to share the risk that you undertook as you leaned into generosity. I think there is a difference between giving something that you never needed versus giving something that costs you. And those listening connect with the concept of sacrifice, and it ultimately points to God's sacrifice of his son, Jesus.
And I think that word sacrifice can sometimes be a little triggering for people, where they can feel this kind of poverty mentality of, I should be suffering in order to be generous. And if I'm not really hurting in some way, then I'm not being generous. It's actually much deeper than that, I think, because you're exactly right about this idea of risk in generosity. I think what makes risk so powerful, especially in the context of sharing your story, is that the only way that we see God show up is if there is a reason for him to need to show up. You know, if the actions we take can be fully accounted for in our own strength, then it's a good story, but not a powerful story. I think the stories that have hung around in my head for weeks and weeks after I hear them are the ones where something happened where the only way that it was going to work is if God showed up. And that's where this idea of risk-taking comes in generosity. When we give, sometimes we don't know if there's going to be enough afterwards. And honestly, sometimes there isn't. I've seen that in my own life where we made some kind of a gift and it was a long time before it all kind of worked out afterwards. But there's other kinds of risk too. Sometimes we don't know how the recipient is going to respond. That inherently takes some risk too. We have heard so many stories where somebody just felt prompted that they should make some kind of a gift to a total stranger or to somebody where only after making the gift did they realize just how much it was needed in that moment and how God was weaving together the story of trust, entrusting Him to follow that small moment of conviction or prompting from the Spirit. And that brings me to the next point. As you're sharing your story, every time you share risk, demonstrate God's provision through your story. And that can also happen in many different ways. Sometimes that's unexpected provision. We give not knowing where that's going to come from and see God show up in powerful ways. I've actually heard quite a few stories where the exact amount somebody has given has shown up in some way or another in the time that followed. Sometimes that provision is in what God lets us see and be a part of through our generosity, that He invites us into the story, and that the power of being in that story and in that moment is such a gift. And sometimes that provision is through transformation, how He actually changes and molds us through our generosity, maybe to deeper contentment or bringing us together with those around us in a more powerful way, or strengthening our faith and our ability to trust Him. But God always provides. He is a good provider. And when we give Him room to work through taking risks and generosity, He always responds if we're willing to look for it. And these are the elements that I think make a powerful generosity story. The magnitude of the generosity actually is not as important as seeing God show up in that story. And that's where we get these ideas of risk and provision.
So we absolutely believe that celebrating what God is doing through your life is a wonderful way to mobilize your community into generosity. The second way is to congregate, to actually get people together in a small group or maybe even a large group. And this is one of my personal favorite ways to encourage and share generosity within your community.
Now, I know you've led quite a number of different groups through a couple different organizations. What makes a small group experience really powerful?
I've learned over the years, talking about money nearly every day for the last 10 years or so, I've learned that trust is so important in these discussions. And one of the quickest ways to build trust is to lead through vulnerability. Honesty and authenticity create an environment that brings down the walls and allows people to share openly about the things they're excited about, the things they're worried about, and money is usually attached to these emotions in some way. And as we focus on generosity, it can introduce stories of joy, but also stories of anxiety and fear. So it's important to create space for people coming from different experiences. One of my favorite ways to do this is to facilitate a journey of generosity, which is a generosity retreat through the organization Generous Giving. The experience itself is a gift to those attending. It doesn't cost anything to them, and the entire experience is crafted to create a pressure-free environment to dive into these topics. And having facilitated half a dozen, I find that people are able to engage with these topics in a way they may never have before.
Yeah, I can't count how many givers we have heard whose story really started with attending a journey of generosity from Generous Giving. Very powerful experience, especially for those who are just trying to wrap their heads around generosity for the first time. But it's also not the only way to go about this kind of experience. We spoke to one giver who, on a regular basis, hosts his own generosity nights where he rents out part of a restaurant and asks 2 or 3 specific people to share their stories of generosity in order to encourage and inspire others, and has just seen a lot of fruit from that experience and has continued to do it on a regular basis over the years. There are now quite a few ministries that are putting out really high quality video content for others to watch and engage in stories of generosity. And just gathering a couple people to watch and think about those stories can be really powerful. And finally, there are lots of good books now on generosity, and getting people together around a book can be powerful as well and is a well-worn path in just regular Christian community.
In its simplest form, if you already have a group that you meet with weekly, consider spending an evening or even a few on the concept of generosity and see where that leads.
Now, the next strategy that we've seen implemented many times is collaboration or giving with others. And one form of that is what we call giving circles. A giving circle is simply a group of people that get together to pool their money together and give to some kind of common cause or purpose. That could be giving to an organization or set of organizations, or that could be giving to an individual or family within their network or community. The point is bringing together people in generosity through shared experience and giving together.
Yeah, I find the concept of a giving circle very compelling because I'm a relational giver, but there are actually many benefits that come with giving together in community. First, there's economies of scale. When people combine their resources, a giving circle can fund larger projects and get involved in things that build more momentum than any individual could do on their own. You also benefit from the different perspectives and experiences of those that you're giving with. As we've covered throughout much of this podcast, there's all kinds of different expressions of generosity. And if you only focus on what you're familiar with, you may be missing out on opportunities to grow. But giving together can often enhance everyone's experience of generosity.
Yeah, I just think back to the different motivations that we covered: joyful givers, relational givers, impact givers, strategists, faithful stewards, compassion givers. Having a group with multiple motivations represented is going to make for a very rich and powerful experience of generosity together, and is also a really good way to grow yourself in these other motivations because you get to see it live in action through other givers that are giving with you.
Giving in community can also help to build momentum. When you feel isolated or alone, it really comes down to your own faithfulness and discipline. But just like being on a sports team, you can be motivated, challenged, and encouraged by those around you aiming for the same goal. And finally, you're likely to be exposed to some new opportunities. In many giving circles, members bring their favorite causes and opportunities to discuss, which can broaden your perspective of what God's doing throughout the world in different areas.
And in the context of trying to mobilize others in your network of relationships, giving circles is just a much lower barrier to inviting somebody in. Be like, hey, let's do this together. I've been giving for a while. I know others who have been giving for a while. Maybe this is something that's newer for you. Come join us. Let's do it together. Let's continue to learn, figure it out, and let's celebrate together. Let's share these stories that we all get to be a part of. That's very encouraging and motivating for people to want to step into, and is a powerful way to jumpstart somebody's own generosity journey.
So if I'm not already part of a giving circle and I want to start or join one, how would I go about that?
Well, each giving circle has a different kind of feel to it. And so one of the very first steps is clarifying your purpose behind the giving circle itself. What's your mission? Do you want to support a shared cause? Are you looking to help specific individuals or organizations? Is your focus on encouraging generosity and building a community of giving? Or is it on tackling a specific issue or cause of some kind? Understanding your purpose behind the group will give you a lot of direction as you seek to bring people into it and how you go about setting it up. Next is selecting your members. So you want to consider who you want to actually invite into the circle with you. There should be ideally some sort of common link between the group. It's either a shared set of common values and passions, or maybe people that are brought together through some other form of community, your church small group or a group of family members. If your goal is primarily in encouraging generosity and helping others get some exposure to generosity, then having a couple people who have a little bit more experience in giving in some way or another, and others who are newer to generosity, helps to mix up the group a little bit to help bring everybody up. Once you have your purpose ironed out and some idea of who's going to be joining you in your group, the next step is to establish some sort of a structure. This can range from pretty informal to pretty formal, and we've seen quite a range over the years. Some circles operate as kind of a casual ad hoc group, while others may actually form a formal organization of some kind, maybe register as a 501c3 or at least an LLC or some kind of formal organizational structure with organizational documents. But regardless of which route you take, there's a couple basic rules that you'll want to think through and have written down in some way. First is, where is the money going to come from? Will people all be contributing the same amount? Will people be contributing different amounts based on their capacity? You also want to think through how much each person will be contributing. You can have groups where everybody contributes $20 or $50 and then give all of it together to one purpose or cause. There are other groups where people contribute very large amounts, $10, $20, or $30,000. Obviously, at that scale, there's usually a little bit more of a formal structure around it, but you can see that there's a huge range of what's possible in a giving circle. You also want to think through how decisions about where and how to give are going to be made. Is it just a simple majority vote? Is there some sort of mechanism for people to bring suggestions for consideration? And how will some of those decisions be made? However you decide to structure it, it is definitely helpful to write down how things should go, especially when it comes to people contributing money, so that there is not any confusion or frustration down the line. The more you think through ahead of time, the less trouble you're likely to run into. And finally, find some way to celebrate milestones as a group. We already talked about the power of generosity story. That is just as true in a giving circle. And so build into your rhythm a way for the group to share in that joy together.
Yeah, there are clearly tons of benefits to giving together with others, but I think it's important to approach it with the right motivations. Our next method of mobilizing within your community is catalyzing, which is giving someone money to give away themselves. I'd say this is a more uncommon strategy, but actually leads to some pretty incredible stories.
Yeah, there are a number of ways to do this. One version of this that we've heard among family members is putting money into a donor advised fund and allowing a child or a grandchild to make grants from that donor advised fund on their own, getting into the habit of trying to have some kind of discernment for how they might go about giving. But it doesn't have to be nearly that formal. Our friend Heather has a particularly powerful way of doing this. She was once giving a talk about generosity to a large group of women and gave every woman in the audience a $20 bill and encouraged them to give it to somebody else. It started as a little bit of an experiment, but over time she started to get many stories back about the opportunities that they had to give and how powerful it had been for them. And she had a term that I loved in describing that kind of an action when she called it leveraging the joy, because she got the joy of giving, the next person got the joy of receiving, and also the joy of giving themselves as well. And so you just get this multiplication effect in joy, in generosity, which can be really powerful in encouraging and jumpstarting that journey in others.
Our final way of mobilizing generosity in your community is to be a champion. This is where you might represent a specific cause or organization to build momentum and invite others to give alongside you.
And just like some of the other examples that we've shared, this can range widely in scale, from something as small as mobilizing your own Bible study or church group to give to a particular cause, all the way up to some of the large impact alliances that we've seen that have brought hundreds or thousands of givers together across a single cause to create a movement around giving in one direction together. I think about the compassion givers out there with an intense and transformational connection to a particular people or cause and wanting others to experience the same power of that connection that they have.
As you can see, there are many opportunities to mobilize generosity within the communities you already have. You can celebrate through sharing your story. You can congregate by bringing people together. You can collaborate by giving together with other givers. You can catalyze by giving to the givers so that they can experience the joy of giving themselves. And you can champion a cause or an organization, inviting others to step into a specific expression of generosity or area of impact.
Now, as we move to our final sphere, we're talking about the capital C church, the global body of Christ. And at this point, we're talking about people beyond your natural sphere of relationships. We have had the privilege of talking to many givers who are mobilizing on this scale and really seeking to build and encourage different aspects of generosity in others in a powerful way. One of the defining features of just about everybody who's mobilizing generosity on a capital C church level is that they will tend to specialize into some particular aspect of generosity. If you think through the 7 dimensions that we've covered already, it's a tall order to encourage every single dynamic of that in others. And so most people will find a particular specialization or corner of the generosity space in order to build up and strengthen givers in that area.
So what does it look like to mobilize a specific aspect of generosity?
Well, I think there's 3 different ways that you can find a corner of the generosity space. The first is by targeting a particular motivation. We talked about 6 motivations all the way back in our first dimension. And there are a number of givers who have really tried to encourage and build up one of those motivations among the church. I think of organizations like Generous Giving, which are really focused on helping people to experience the joy of generosity in all kinds of forms. I think about organizations like the National Christian Foundation or other donor-advised fund platforms, which are heavily focused on the strategy of giving. I think of ministries like Gospel Patrons that are really focused on the relational aspect of generosity, on this partnership between givers and the ministries or the workers that they support. And you can play this out for every motivation, that there are those who are helping others to experience that in their own generosity. In a similar way, you can also mobilize generosity by targeting a particular dimension. We've talked about 7 different dimensions, and there are people and organizations that are very creatively helping givers to engage in one of these dimensions or another. I think of organizations like Solving the World's Greatest Problems, really encouraging people to hone in the domain of their giving, to be passionately connected to some kind of a need in the world. Our own ministry, the Finish Line Pledge, began primarily in the allocation space, helping others to think through how much do I give, how much do I keep, and how much is enough. And I think of organizations like Generous Church, helping to build movements of generosity around the world, helping to encourage others to mobilize their own generosity forward. All of these organizations began from givers who wanted to invite others into a particular dimension of generosity. And then finally, some givers or organizations are focused on a particular subset or population. There's organizations like Women Doing Well, inspiring generosity among women. I think of the Generous Business Owner podcast, led by 3 business owners with powerful stories of generosity themselves, seeking to bring other business owners into that journey together. And I think of Generous Generations, working to plant seeds of generosity among children and youth that will grow into flourishing lives of generosity as they grow older. And so you can see that finding your space either through a particular motivation, a particular dimension of generosity among the 7 that we've talked about, or among a particular population can really help to hone in how you go about mobilizing and encouraging and inspiring and challenging others into greater generosity.
One final point on the fourth sphere of mobilization, the global church, is that not necessarily every giver is called to mobilize the broader church in generosity, but some definitely are. And there's a wonderful community of others across the world doing just that. So that brings us to an end of our review of the 4 spheres of mobilization: companion, children, community, and the church. In our next episode, we're going to tie all 4 of these together. Stay tuned.